from that later on. Now, the National Ugly Mug Scheme might have a light-hearted name, but it's a very serious cause. It looks out for the rights and the health and safety of sex workers. However, it is suffering from a funding crisis and says it could be forced to close within months if it can't raise £100,000 it needs to survive. I'm joined now by Alex Bryce of the scheme. Welcome, Alex. Can you just tell us a little bit more about what the scheme does?
Yeah, so sex workers are disproportionately targeted by the most dangerous perpetrators and often don't feel confident in reporting those incidents to the police. So we act as a third party. Sex workers can report to us and we work with the police to bring those perpetrators to justice. And we also warn sex workers about potential dangers to them.
Tell us about some of your recent successes.
Well, actually, only last month there was a rapist who targeted sex workers in East London, torturing them at knife point and using other weapons. And I think if it wasn't the National, the police would have never known about him. A sex worker initially contacted us, didn't initially want to report to the police, and we encouraged her to do so and supported her through that process. And thankfully, the Metropolitan Police have a really good sexual offences unit who dealt with it really well.
And presumably, you say because they operate in a grey area, sex workers, they don't want to deal directly with the police. That's where you come in.
Yeah, and the stigma attached to what they do, but also the laws, aspects of sex work is criminalised, so it makes it much harder for sex workers to access police. And, most of the time the police, certainly when sex workers report incidents, deal with it well, but there are some occasions where they don't, and sex workers kind of feel more stigmatised.
And now you are saying you're struggling now for funding. Does the funding traditionally for the scheme come from the government?
Initially, we had a pilot which started in July 2012 nationally, and we were funded by the Home Office then. But the Home Office made it clear from the start that however successful the pilot was, they would never fund us beyond the pilot. And that came at a bad time because that was when police and crime commissioners were set up. So all the police funding was devolved, which means now we're faced with a problem of having to go to 43 different police forces asking for small amounts of money to fund what is essentially a tiny scheme in terms of the cost and the resources used. So we face a constant struggle, and my job tends to be, begging police and crime commissioners and chief constables for funding, which should be a given, really. It speaks for itself with our outcomes and the impact.
But yeah, you're saying that you could be out of the whole scheme could be wound up within months. So is it not going so well asking for money from these commissioners?
Last financial year we got I think 39 out of 43 police forces who donated small amounts, and the Metropolitan Police donated a little bit more to cover their proportion of the work. But the problem is now we've got a couple of months in the bank and we have to go and do the same ask all over again, and it's just a really difficult funding position to be in, and we don't have any job security. I don't want it to sound like a sob story, but those who target sex workers are a danger to everyone, and I think by now our outcomes should have been sufficient to convince whether it's the government or some kind of national, like the National Crime Agency or whatever, to provide us the funding, so we don't need to keep going to beg for £2,000 or £3,000 from 43 different police forces to keep us going.
Because it's actually a relatively small amount of money when you look at it in the scheme of police funding, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, we had, sometimes we have really senior police officers visit our offices, which are absolutely tiny, and they sort of joke that, sort of their weekly tea budget would pay for those offices. That's what we're talking about, really small amounts of money, and the average cost to investigate a single rape is £100,000, and the average cost to investigate a single murder, and that's taking away the human cost, obviously, is £1 million. And, 151 sex workers have been murdered in the UK since 1990, so a scheme like this is saving lives, preventing crime, and also saving the police money. So it really should be an easy sell, but it's not proving to be as easy as it should be, really.
What are the cases? I mean, we've talked about the headline grabbing cases there, but what are the other issues that sex workers come to you with, I should say?
Depending on the sector of sex work, I mean, all sectors, so working indoors on the streets, are disproportionately targeted by sex offenders. It's around 20% of the incidents reported to us are actually rapes, which is much higher than the average for for non-sex workers, for the whole population, but also with certainly escorts. We get a lot of stalking and harassment cases. You get kind of hate crimes, so sex workers being targeted by people throwing eggs, you know, sort of low-level stuff, and robberies. So really all kinds of crime, and sex workers are disproportionately targeted. And there's loads of evidence that those who target sex workers go on to target the wider public.
And Alex Bryce from the National Ugly Mug Scheme, thank you very much for joining us and telling us your story. Let's get a look at the update on the travel and the weather.